Hello, I'm Chris Salisbury, and today I'm talking to Chris Butler. Chris is Professor of Primary Care at the University of Oxford, where he also leads the Infections and Acute Care Research Group, and he's Clinical Director of the University of Oxford Primary Care Clinical Trials Unit. So, Chris, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
You look like you're somewhere very sunny, and I'm talking to you from a cold and windy Bristol. So, where are you?
Yeah. I'm actually in Cape Town I was going to say in the shadow of Table Mountain, but just below Table Mountain. In fact, in the reflection behind me in the door there, you might see a bit of the mountain, which I think is a great place to be talking to you from because the influence of this city and that mountain is in a way my spiritual medical home where I sort of started off studying medicine just around the corner from where I am now.
Brilliant, because that's a lovely introduction to the first question I was going to ask you about. Tell us a bit about your background, because you grew up in South Africa. So, tell us a bit
Mm.
about your background.
Yeah, so I grew up in a small town in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, now known as Makanda, formerly Grahamstown. My dad was a professor of English literature at Rhodes University. And I kind of went with the currents and landed up studying English literature myself, which is fantastic. And if anybody says that was a waste for a medical career, I will object in the strongest possible terms. Understanding stories is so fundamentally important. Being able to tell stories, interpreting them is so fundamentally important to clinical medicine, but also to research. But in any event, at the end of my BA, it shows how old I am, but in those days there was a military draft, and I had three choices. I could go to the military, I could go to jail for 6 years, or I could leave the country. Actually, four choices at that time, or I could carry on studying. So I kind of looked around for quite a long degree, and I was sort of thinking that I landed up, by default studying a BA, as enjoyable and valuable as it was, but that actually I had a passion for something more scientific and um, clinically important. So I luckily, I mean, I don't know how it happened, but they accepted me into medical school in Cape Town and got the most fantastic clinical training here and landed up also doing a bit of pediatrics, working in the trauma unit a bit. And then the military really came down on me and said if I wasn't in a particular military camp on the 2nd of January, I would be arrested. Curiously, that military camp goes by the name of Bethlehem. So if I wasn't in Bethlehem, I'd be in trouble. So I then landed up leaving the country, going to Saskatchewan, where I was a solo doc for a while. And then I came back to South Africa and uh, worked as a medical registrar at Cecilia Makiwane Hospital in the Ciskei, which was in a so-called homeland where I was immune from the draft call up. Yeah, so in a nutshell, that sort of led me to uh, again face choices that were quite stark, and I landed up meeting my partner there in the Mdantsane, and we went to Britain for 6 months to start off with, and one thing led to another. Went to Canada for a while, came back, went to Canada for another while, came back to Britain, and that's where our resting place is now. So
So, because you went to Wales, you went to Cardiff, didn't you, as a research fellow
that's
and a
right. Yes.
lecturer and
Yeah,
a senior lecturer? Why Wales?
that's correct. Correct. Well, in those days, there were very little opportunities for academic primary care people to develop their careers. And Nigel Stott, is a great mentor of mine, one of the giants of our discipline. Um, he claims, I think, that the University of Wales College of Medicine was the first um, academic primary care unit in or department in the country. But I think colleagues from Edinburgh disagree, and that debate probably runs.
Yes.
But Nigel advertised for a clinical fellow position in general practice half time academic, half-time clinical, and I was a half-time partner in London Health Centre, where again I got fantastic clinical experience, but was able to do teaching and start research. So it was one of very few openings that was available, and luckily enough, luckily for me, I was successful in applying. And you know
So
that brought me to Cardiff, and I sort of went up through the ranks there until becoming a head of Department of Primary Care and Public Health. But I always kept my clinical work going,
mm,
which has been key to my career, I think, all along.
you always thought you wanted to be an academic from when you were at medical school, or
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think in a way, a full-time clinical job in general practice might have been a bit too tough for me. It's when I've stopped doing clinical work now, but you know, I saw my colleagues, when I was still doing it a couple of years back, my colleagues were sort of getting there 7 in the morning, leaving at 7 at night, having seen heaven knows how many patients, made so many critically important decisions. And then they have a little bite to eat, and then they open up the computer and it's the results and the referrals. And, I don't think I was so strong enough to sustain that decades in, decades out, but also the curiosity and the quality improvement aspect of research, was a bug that bit me early on, and I just knew that this was the field for me. Trying to get under the skin of these problems that we were facing each day. I like to think it was sort of clinically led in that, I'd scratch my head sometimes with a patient thinking, "Oh, I wonder what would be the best way of doing it." And then that kind of fed into formulation of questions and grant applications and so on.
the second half of your answer about wanting to answer questions I found very convincing. The first half about it was all terribly hard work. As people will find in a minute, you're not exactly afraid of hard work. You do a lot of different things, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Weren't you also dean for a while in Cardiff?
I was dean of research in the
Ah,
medical school. Yeah, not of the whole outfit, but dean of research. Yes.
and how did you
Yeah.
find that?
I enjoyed it. It was quite tricky because, as a humble GP, you're dealing with, a lot of very clever people with white coats on and rats and labs and petri dishes and so on. And, we don't have the machine that goes ping, we don't
No.
have the labs and stuff. What we
Mm,
do is we deal with people, we manage uncertainty, and I think there is still a bit of a prejudice, amongst the
mm,
gene jockeys and the immunologists. And, there was still a bit of that attitude where they turn up, "Look, I need a sample, young man. I need a
mm,
sample. Get me a sample." I said, "What's the hypothesis?" "Oh, don't worry your pretty little head about that, my friend. Just get me
yes,
the sample and you stay in your box. So there's a lot
yes.
of that still going on. But
Okay.
I think things have changed
Okay.
and much more mutual respect.
And then in 2013, you went to your current role in Oxford, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And you're doing big trials. Um, but when I looked at your CV, something I hadn't realised is some of your early research were qualitative studies, quite a different
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Working and particularly working with Steve Rolnick and others on
Yeah.
motivational
Yeah.
interviewing, and you're still involved in that. But that's a very
Yeah.
different paradigm from big complex randomized controlled trials. So why the change, and do those different interests, are they quite different, or do they kind of complement each other?
No, I think they very much complement each other, and that stream was always in parallel because I suppose a couple of points. The first is that no information is useful unless it is used. And if you're coming up with a new way of doing things, a new intervention, you've shown that this works, you need to take the clinicians and the patients who need to act on that information with you. So complex behavior change must happen, and there are different ways of doing that. So that needs evidence behind it. How do you achieve that? But there's very few simple interventions in our world. They're all complex interventions, and therefore they all need heavy social science, multidisciplinary input if they're going to reap the dividend that they deserve. And it goes back to what I said about the stories and my love of English literature. in understanding what your findings are, it's a narrative. There's the quantitative stuff, but excuse me, at the same time, there's stories behind it that really gets you under the skin of the problem, of the meaning of the quantitative research. So, for example, just last week we published results from a trial. It's called the PRUDENCE trial of point of care testing to guide antibiotic use for respiratory tract infections. Amazing trial, in my view, 10 countries, lots of, we recruited a sample size, very well worked out intervention. And overall, we showed no benefit from testing compared to not testing people who are consulting in primary care. And that's a massive finding
Mm,
because a lot of people
mm,
say you should not give an antibiotic before you've tested.
mm,
And yet here we showed that this major tool that is being promoted for antimicrobial stewardship actually wasn't having the effect that people assumed it was.
mm,
The need for evidence-based medicine up there in lights. So how do we understand that? Well, luckily from the outset, we had planned this process evaluation where, Sarah Tonkin-Crine, Marta Wannert, other Sybil and Thierens, lots of these real black belt social scientists, qualitative interviews, spoke to the clinicians who used the tests, spoke to the patients, and then we get a nuanced understanding of, okay, well, it's not yes or no. There's groups within this where you might find benefit. If you do something differently, then you're going to make progress. So the behavior change aspect and the social science aspect is fundamental to everything that I've
mm,
ever done, I think.
mm.
Yeah.
And you went on after doing that kind of research to do a number of randomized controlled trials, but that experience really seemed to me to come into its own during the COVID pandemic when you led to enormous adaptive platform trials and you got them off the ground in a matter of weeks and recruited thousands
Yeah.
of people and produced results within months. Not everyone will know what an adaptive platform trial is. Can you just briefly explain what that is?
Yeah, so perhaps I'll just rewind a little bit to a study that I was involved in before that as part of an EU-funded consortium called Prepare. And, from the swine flu pandemic, we realized that trials started too late to be of any use within a pandemic. So that study built up the expertise to try and get trials going from the get-go. And we did a trial in primary care called the ALICE trial of oseltamivir, an antiviral for flu. And, one person said to me, look, that drug could be out of date in a year or two. Why don't you design a trial that is flexible, that could take in new interventions as the trial is going on? And that's called an adaptive trial, where you can add to the protocol without losing quality as the trial goes on. And we did that trial within budget, within our time, and we finished just before the pandemic. So we couldn't keep that trial open because it was closed now. And if it was still open, we could have just made amendments and would have carried on. As a remap cap trial was able to do because they started later than us. Any event, so with that interest that I then developed of the adaptive trial and a platform trial that could take a number of interventions at the same time, and as I say, you could add as you go along. We designed a trial. That first one was called Principle because everyone wanted us to do hydroxychloroquine. People were sort of scurrying around in the dark, clutching at straws. And I think over 200 trials clutched at that particular straw. And very few, I mean, less than a handful gave useful information. But nevertheless, we designed this trial. We used Bayesian statistics. A lot of modeling went into it. And I think I got the message that we'd been funded in mid-March 2020, and we had our first patient in on the 2nd of April 2020. So we didn't cut corners, I'll say that. We were able to have dialogues with the regulators, with the ethics committees beforehand. They didn't cut corners. It was all done very rigorously, but with that helpful dialogue to get us going. And that trial, that first trial, was focusing on repurposed medicines, and we uh, produced evidence about 7 repurposed medicines. One of the first outputs was showing that doxycycline and then azithromycin were not useful treatments in the community for COVID-19. And that changed practice around the world, I think. I remember a colleague from Belize meeting up with her at one point who had a copy of that doxycycline paper. Says, I walk around the wards and the clinics in Belize showing people this and telling them to stop. And, guidelines in India, the WHO and so forth changed. And we had clinical alerts where the chief medical officers said to every prescriber in the UK, do not use these drugs for that indication.
Yeah, I mean, that was an
Uh,
incredibly important trial and necessary at that time. But
mm,
to get it off, I mean, I've done trials. I know how
mm,
hard it is to get them off the ground, to start recruiting patients within 2 weeks, or it must
mm.
have been an enormous amount of setting up that was going on before, or perhaps you were building on the fact you already had many of the methods already worked out and the recruiting
Yeah.
sites already engaged through the trials unit. Is that?
Yeah, that EU funded trial helped us with the design and statistics and so forth. But the NHS and the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research here in the UK, was of fundamental importance to get us going. And the urgent public health approach, where they said instead of everybody who wants to doing a trial of hydroxychloroquine, let's do one national trial.
Mm.
So the NIHR, the Research Delivery Network, the Urgent Public Health platform swung behind 3 key platform trials in the UK. So there were fewer trials, but these were of international importance, the REMAP CAP, recovery and principal and later panoramic. So that in that way of taking a systems-wide approach, we made sure that we weren't engaging in massive research wastage at all
Mm.
that time. But to go back to your point about work, I've still got a little bit of PTSD, and I don't use that term lightly
Mm.
from those times, because I was talking about how hard GPs work, but that was a 6:30 to 10 p.m. every day of the year, including Christmas, for a couple of years. And obviously massive team behind us, amazing people who are all working like that. I mean, within a couple of weeks, we opened up 800 general practices as sites with contracts, etc., GCP, all. So yeah, it was perpetual. Yeah.
That is staggering, really, but
Mm.
incredibly important at a time when we needed that kind of important work. Some of the stuff you've done more recently, like Panoramic, it's getting a bit like you were talking about rats and labs and people in white coats. It's quite hard science, cutting edge, new drugs. Um, and yet, something that interested me about you, I remember hearing you do a keynote lecture at a conference probably 15 years ago in Wales, in Cardiff. And what really struck me then is that you're doing this kind of cutting edge, complex trials, but it really struck me that you really do have the heart of a GP, of a real GP. You understood what real general practice is about and cared about it, and you worked in a very poor part of the Welsh Valleys. Do you think that your experience as a GP has informed your work a lot?
I go back to one of our founding fathers, Tudor Hart, who formulated that inverse care law, that those most in need of healthcare are the least likely to get it. And in early in February 2020, I was working in the Cunnin Valley, Mountain Ash, and I think I saw the first patient in the valley, or certainly in that practice, who had COVID, and I was terrified. I didn't really know what to do. Nobody knew what to do, but I checked his oxygen and did the best I could. And but what struck me was that I had no treatment, but I had no study to put this person into to figure out what we should be doing. So that led us to sort of elaborate what is known as the inverse research participation law, that those who've got the most to contribute to research and the most to gain from the findings, often marginalized people, people living in high social deprivation, these are the very people who have the least chance to participate in research.
Mm.
And so that addressing that, um, based on my sort of clinical experience with a patient in front of me, what the heck do I do now? And we've got to have the machinery that is standing there ready to give us the answers. So that I think that sort of illustrates why or how the clinical interface has always fed my passion for the deep understanding of these questions.
Absolutely. So over the last 20 years, your contribution's been recognised in lots of ways. You're an NIHR senior investigator, a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. There's probably only a handful of GPs who can say that. And then honorary professorships in Stellenbosch and Cape Town in South Africa and McMaster in Canada. And then you were awarded this Doctor Honoris Causa by Antwerp University, which is, I gather, one of the most prestigious awards that any university can offer for exceptional lifetime achievements. And that's all richly deserved for the important number of things you've done. But what do you think you've learned from all that experience? What tips would you pass on to new early career academics who want to achieve half of what you've done?
Gosh, that's a big question. Look, I think if I had to say one thing is connect yourself as closely as possible with the realm of care or the problems that you're trying to solve. Um, you know, to go back to the work that I've done that's always been clinically rooted, you just need to be familiar with the real world context of where people are working. I mean, I'll tell a quick story against myself. I did a trial, a PACE trial, that we were doing using C-reactive protein, a point of care test to guide antibiotic prescribing decisions. And perhaps shouldn't have done, but I designed the study and I also recruited a few patients into it in Mountain Ash, where there's massive problems of COPD that I was concerned by. And so I thought, well, look, I better, I'm telling all these GPs to please recruit, and here I am, I've got a patient. So I start recruiting, and I've got this form, and I've got that form, I've got the next form, and I thought, which idiot designed this damn trial? And then I think, oh, hold on, it was me. So I mean, that's just about research process. Make it easy, make it realistic to do the research, make it easy for the patients to contribute. And so that's just about the research process, but then it goes back to that link. How does this evidence relate? Have you got a solution looking for a problem? And that's often the case that I see around me today. Start with a problem, identify bottom up. What do the people out there need? What's the evidence they need? And that's why PPI is so, public contributors are so important. That's why starting with the clinicians is so important. Point of care testing is an interest of mine. And so many people come and they say, look, I've got this magic machine that can do A, B, and C. And I say, but why do we need A, B, and C? They say, no, but we've got to be able to, And I say, no, hold on. Ask the guy who's sitting at the clinical coalface. Is that going to help them, or is it just going to add hassle? So it's these connections with reality that I say don't ever lose and always develop them.
Mm. You said it was a big question. Any other pressing tips?
I think be confident. Be confident because, microbiologists, for example, have often said to me, unless a swab is taken by a healthcare professional, it's not much good. But in the panoramic trial, for example, we've done sub-studies where people have in fact taken their own swabs and they've even taken their own blood tests, sent them back to the lab, and we find perfectly good, usable, rigorous data from that, And, just say, look, you might have a white coat in a lab, but I know the world that I inhabit, and I'm confident that these findings are useful. So let's I think gone are the days when GP researchers need to be a little bit insecure in relation to the fields and the worlds that we inhabit.
Good, thank you. Finally, what do you do outside work?
Well, I was going to say I'm a runner, but I think that's a bit grandiose. I'm a jogger,
Mhm.
and I we have a little cottage in the Welsh Mountains, in the Black Mountains. It was sort of a ruin that we got in 2011, and it's completely off grid. There's no signal, there's no mains, anything. And we go there as much as possible, get on with some work, but also hiking on the Black Mountains. I can think of very little else that brings me so much pleasure.
Mhm.
Um, Being in South Africa, developing, working with colleagues, developing new research ideas. You asked me about not related to work, but I suppose that's so much part of my life that I
Mm.
just assume it's everything, all encompassing. So I don't know. Yeah, I've got, yeah, obviously the whole important thing. My wife's an amazing person to be with, and I get so much from my relationship with her. The kids keep me lively and growing, and I've got a 15-and-a-half-year-old Labrador that I love to bits.
Do you spend much time in South Africa?
Not as much as I would have liked, but I'm here for a couple of months now, and I think as time goes by, Chris, I'm hoping to spend more time here. You know, the I always go back to doing research in the intended use populations.
Mm.
And in pandemic preparedness and in many other areas, we need to be doing research amongst those people who are most likely to benefit. And just around the corner from me here in Table Mountain is the Crossroads Camp, and former Crossroads Squatter Camp, and Khayelitsha, where massive informal settlements are. And the people living there are the ones who are most affected by many communicable and non-communicable diseases. And getting evidence that applies to them has to be done with them. And so expanding from European contexts to LMICs in future research is something that I really want to do. And that's one of the reasons why I'm here now.
Mm. Brilliant. Chris, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Um, Thanks for doing it.
No, thanks so much, Chris. And we certainly go back a long way because I
Mhm.
think you kindly uh, gave us a keynote address at an all Wales GP conference in the 90s. And that was a great inspiration. And of course, I've followed your amazing work over the years. And thank you for your contribution as well.